Greetings all, and welcome back to A Traveler's Guide 2. So we have come across a unique little challenge for us to overcome in this video series and some in the future. As while it is easy to be able to analyze and discuss entities that at least still exist in some form or another, it is a more difficult affair for us to try and analyze something that no longer exists. You see, our next step in our work is Zebes, but as you might be aware, there is a slight problem there. It no longer exists. Yeah, thanks to the Hunter, one of the most prominent planets in the history of the Space Pirates and Galactic Federation is now nothing but space dust. But fear not, for we do have a solution to this glaring problem. We call it the PHH, short for the Pre-Hunter Hologram. This special format is going to allow us to look back at the history and biota of this planet with the same level of detail that we normally get with any existing planet. We can even wire in our crewmates to experience as close of a simulation as possible as we can get for live commentary. And how does it work, you might ask? Arrow won't tell us exactly, so I can't help you there.
I'll tell you how it works as soon as I get more than a few thanks for putting this contraption together. You have an idea how much of a pain in the ass it was to install this thing? Your damn luck is compatible with Earth tech.
Right. Anyways, with it, we can continue our work here as we take on A Traveler's Guide to Zebes. And from there, we can start the real subject of this video presentation, A Traveler's Guide to Crateria. Before we dive right into Crateria, let's take a look at Planet Zebes itself and a brief history of the events that had transpired there prior to the destruction of the planet with the help of some informational slides. Planet Zebes is one of the most well-known worlds among scholars of Chozo and Galactic Federation lore, as it served as the battleground for some of the most devastating battles to ever be fought in Federation history. Located near star FS-176 with a mass of 4.8 billion teratons and a diameter of 11,700 kilometers, Zebes was classified as a Class 5b, or 19 depending upon the source, planet with huge concentrations of earthic ore, creating a crust that was both thick and surprisingly hollow and thus ideal for subterranean construction. Zebes possessed two small moons, larger due to having a normal revolution pattern, while the other had a retrograde motion. Despite the fact that Zebes was home to some of the most inhospitable lands in the galaxy, especially since a flesh-eating bacteria that had been carried to the planet by Zoomers killed off a large portion of the planet's natural biota, it possessed a thriving and decent variety of life forms, most of which were creatures completely unique to the otherwise barren world. The planet was originally colonized by the Chozo and uses both a base of operations and a true planet that they could call home. In the past, it is also possible to see these influences and the extent of their reach, as large portions of even the harshest lands of the world bear their image in many forms, whether it's simply in the tunnels and caverns they built into the crust, or the numerous Chozo statues that once crowded its interior. However, peace was not to last on the planet, as a sentient AI by the name of Mother Brain rebelled against the Chozo and took the fledgling Zebesian space parts under her wing to remove them. Although the Chozo had constructed a planetary protection shield to defend themselves from attack, the Zebesian space pirates were able to use stolen technology to generate a micro black hole that destabilized and disabled it, the weakness itself only being revealed to the Zebesian space pirates through Mother Brain, as their control capsule was constructed and powered in the exact same fashion as the shield. Many Chozo structures were destroyed in the process, and the Chozo themselves were forced to flee to unknown parts of the universe. This invoked the ire of the Galactic Federation, and especially the Hunter, a child that had been raised by the Chozo on the planet after the death of her parents by a space pirate raiding party run by Ridley. With the very blood and power of the Chozo in her veins, the Hunter worked under the direction of the Galactic Federation and attacked the Zebesian space pirate scourge on the planet she had once called home, cleaning out its most powerful generals and ultimately confronting Mother Brain in the artificial zone Torian, as well as her minions, the Metroids, which Mother Brain and the Zebesian space pirates had been experimenting on in order to make them the most powerful bioweapons they possibly could be. Armed with the technology of the Chozo, however, the Hunter was able to neutralize the threat that they posed and defeated Mother Brain, and while an attack on her ship forced her to find legendary power suit in Chozodia to destroy the space pirate mothership, the Hunter was eventually able to leave the planet and left the Zebesian space pirate forces in ruin. Afterwards, the place became a haven for researchers of all types and was occupied by around 200 researchers and archaeologists that showed interest in the numerous Chozo ruins on the planet's surface and underground tunnels, before the planet was reinvaded by the Zebesian space pirates and converted into a base for them once more. Later, after the near eradication of Metroids on the home planet of SR-388, Ridley stole the last infant Metroid alive and took it back to Zebes, where the Zebesian space pirates had regrouped and rebuilt Mother Brain, changing the planet into something both familiar and different with alterations to the planet's interior as a result of further base building and bioengineering projects. The Hunter was once again forced to enter the planet and clean the scourge of the Zebesian space pirates from it, eventually defeating the 4 major Zebesian generals left and confronting Mother Brain for the second and final time. During this confrontation, the hunter almost died and was only saved by the intervention of the infant Metroid, now in the form of the big Metroid, which drained Mother Brain's energy to restore the hunter fully, only to die at the hands of the AI and giving the hunter the Hyper Beam. With this overpowered weapon, she succeeded in destroying Mother Brain, but did so not realizing that Mother Brain's own lifeline had been connected to a self-destructive ice Centaurian near the planet's core. With the power gifted to her by the infant, the hunter was able to escape from Zebes, along with the few Edecuns and Jakora she had befriended on her journey, before the core of the planet detonated, destroying it in a single massive explosion of cosmic destruction. While the destruction of Planet Zebes may not have been an intentional fault by the hunter, the Galactic Federation was not happy with her, not only for violating a direct order to kill every single Metroid alive, but because her actions robbed the Federation of a planet that was of great economic and political value. It was after this that her and the Federation mostly parted ways, and only further points of contact between the two would only lead to more turmoil in her life aboard the bottle ship and the BSL research station. Crateria serves the mountainous craggy surface world of Zebes, and is relatively devoid of life as a result of frequent acid rainstorms on the surface, though it still teemed with life just below the surface. It had repeatedly been used as a landing area for the hunter on her visits to the planet, and is known for being the major access point to some of the more vibrant parts of the world, including the old access shaft to the original Torian, which was considered to be just another part of the area after Mother Brain's defeat. To the west of this area was the entrance to Brinstar, and the only place in Crateria where plant life really seemed to thrive. Moreover, to the west were the statues that served as the gateway key to the new Torian at the heart of the planet, where the hunter would conquer the Zebesian forces of the planet at the cost of its very existence. To the east were the remains of Chozodia, which was partially demolished in the wake of the space-powered mothership's destruction, and the wrecked ship, which served to connect Crateria with Meridia far beneath the planet's surface. The open air of Crateria may have made it seem desolate and too quiet, but the pools of intense lava bubbling up via volcanic activity from the deepest parts of Lower Norfair, as well as the few pools of surface water, nonetheless made it an interesting place to explore if one was looking to pick up a few upgrades before exploring the livelier parts of the planet. It is lastly noted that this is the area where the hunter had to face a Torizo during our final mission on the planet after taking the Morph Ball bomb upgrade it had been holding. Now, before we get to the life forms that are once present here, there is another snag that needs to be addressed, and that is the fact that life forms found on Zebes changed between the Hunter's Zero mission and our final mission on the planet. As such, in order to keep things consistent, we will cover all known entities between those two time periods separately, starting with those present during the Zero mission, and then those that are present on our final mission on Zebes. Without further ado then, let's start with the Zero mission entries. Rippers are fairly small arthropods that are rarely much of a threat, but can nonetheless prove to be a bit of an annoyance if they were not observed carefully. Rippers were unique in that, while they possessed excellent vision that was perfectly adapted for living in deep caverns with little light, they do not have actual brains that can really process that information. Instead, their neurons were scattered in small clumps underneath their shells and acted as separate processors that controlled the internal features of their body, the moving parts, and the thought processes individually. These creatures possessed a powerful electromagnetic organ in their bodies that made it easier for them to float in the air, as they could not actually fly. Instead, these brown-colored beasts would grab onto a surface with the hind legs and then push off from it, flying in a straight line and staying in the same air for some time thanks to this special organ, before ultimately arriving on the other side and repeating the process again. This back-and-forth movement was highly characteristic of these creatures and was what gave them their name, and was little capable of stopping them from ripping them through the air. Anything that was caught in their flight path would be harmed by the tusk-like mandibles the creatures possessed on their face. Despite this interesting power though, Rippers were not really a threat, as they only fed on small insects they could gather while gliding in the air on the surface of the rock walls they kicked off of, and never strayed from their path of movement. Of course, if they were in the way, there was little that could be done, as their thick armored shell made them effectively impervious to all forms of direct damage in the case of their stronger variants, not counting the destructive power of weapons like the super missile and the power bomb, or the sheer energy delivered from a shine spark or the screw attack. If one was in possession of a freezing weapon, however, Rippers could actually be of great help, as the bodies could be frozen and used as platforms to reach higher areas, as long as one could make the jump from Ripper to Ripper in the air before the creatures thawed. As a result, they had the potential to be more helpful than harmful, and as long as direct contact wasn't made with their fronts, they were completely benign in their interactions, granting them a place within threat level Alpha. The Crateria was a small bony fish that is really much of an issue to deal with as a result of its benign nature, though this may not have always been proven to be the case for stronger specimens. The Crateria was a little different from most types of fish in that it actually had two different life cycle stages that were designed for two completely different lifestyles. Normal Crateria had the appearance of medium-sized fish, possessing a very similar skeletal structure and organ system. However, they're set apart from other types of fish because they actually did not have a scaly outer skin at all. Instead, the bodies of these creatures were coated with a thick layer of brown or purple material similar to hardened skin that gave them a rock-like appearance and granted them a surprising amount of resilience against direct attack, though they could still be eliminated with minor gunfire. Moreover, their entire body structure had a jointed form that made their bodily movements seem more artificial than natural, despite the fact that they were living creatures. In this stage, these entities would use their purple or brown colored camouflage to blend in near the bottom of the ocean bodies they occupied while feeding on smaller fish and other creatures in their native habitat. They are normally non-aggressive in this state, but at present in schools, they might have tried to attack larger creatures in order to use the numbers game to score a free meal. As these fish grew and developed, they eventually would reproduce and immediately mutate into a new form. In this transformation, they became a metallic gray color, grew to nearly twice their normal size, and developed a thick bony protrusion on the front of their heads that could increase the amount of damage they could sustain by a considerable amount. These Crateria were much more vicious than their smaller brethren and would attack just about anything that entered their territory, using their large jaws and sharp teeth to rip apart prey items in a bloody display of primal violence. These creatures had to be destroyed if encountered as adults, as they would not start pursuing their target unless they died or got out of the water, and this aggression could make them a noble issue for explorers to deal with if they couldn't be put down with heavy weaponry, in turn securing them a solid footing within threat level beta.
They're really big fat fish though, these ones. Cause you might go out and have a nest and out, away from all the yelling and all that. You just sit down, plug out rods and bait. Let's get no damn bugs with a long button in your hand. Make these damn things, they'll be stir fry for next time, I swear.
Right, so a little scarce here for Crateria at first, I know, but don't fret, for the bulk of the life that could be found here is right up next in the hunter's final visit to the area. The S-bug was a small flesh-eating parasite that's usually found within dark, dank environments and the presence of fresh corpses. Little is known about these small green creatures, as they were very small and difficult to capture, but what is known is that they were completely harmless to living creatures, as they are not built to be able to digest most types of living tissue. As such, these entities fed on carrion dominantly as part of their diet, and they rarely ever did so in the sight of others, as they were averse to confrontation and would flee the moment that something began to approach them. It is strongly believed that these creatures were not native to Zebes and had managed to outperform native Zebesian parasites that existed prior to their introduction onto the planet, but the total impact these entities could have had on the ecosystem is indeterminable now, since Zebes is no longer in existence. As a whole though, they are nothing to be truly feared by most, and thus are best placed within threat level Alpha. The members of the Scree family belong to a group of bat-like insectoids that specialize in using their entire bodies to attack anything and everything that dare to get near them. Screes possessed a thin, elongated main body with only a single pair of limbs, namely the small feet that allow them to roost from the ceilings of caves and corridors. Their heads were rather large for their body size and possessed a pair of compound eyes that allowed the creatures to even see in the darkest of environments. In addition, they possessed a pair of large wings that nearly covered the length of their body and were attached to the torso by a special band of exoskeleton material that could actually be rotated around the softer plate of tissue, giving these monsters the appearance of living drills. These beasts usually spent their time eating small insects from the air and did not bother anyone from afar. But if a target got too close to it and the Scree felt that it was being threatened, it would swoop down from its perch while rotating its wings, turning its body into an organic drill. If the Scree missed its target, it might continue to drill into the ground and hope that it can dig a deep enough hole that its attacker would leave them alone. But if they felt that they were threatened beyond escape, they would instead fling rocks up from drilling into the floor and purposely break the exoskeleton apart to send shards of material flying at nearby targets in the form of shrapnel. This latter option would kill the Scree in the process, but it was done for the good of its fellow brethren, as they tended to travel in groups and could thus be a pain to handle in large numbers. Thankfully, the exoskeleton material was fairly weak and easily damaged, and what damage they could deal through direct contact was fairly limited, as a few shots from a standard weapon was enough to dispatch them, in most cases regardless, landing them in place within threat level Alpha.
That's enough for a golden special, but we're not gonna keep them for long before they go kablooey on me. Gotta freeze them and not kill them, but anything out of them. Not a great time, you get used to having their best blood on you. The members of the Zoomer family are mollusks that are linked together by the shared scavenging habits and semi-shelled bodies. Gamers are an evolutionary offshoot of the Zoomer and are rarely distinguished by possessing only 3 eyes, much like Silva's, and the possession of a much thicker carapace that makes them more resilient against attack. In fact, the variants that existed on Brio and Talon 4 are completely invulnerable to most beam weapons, the only exception being the devastating space-powered plasma beam, while gamers that are once found in Zebes were not quite as sturdy. These entities have the same basic diet as the Zoomer, but they keep their spikes retracted most of the time in order to help them blend in with their surroundings. If a Gamer is threatened, however, it will extend its spikes and pull its head into its armored carapace. In this state, the creatures are impossible to hurt with standard weapons, and only plasma-based weaponry and concussive weapons like missiles will be able to hurt them. Getting close to them at this point is usually a bad idea, as the spines are much larger than that of the Zoomer and can be easy to jump into if one is not paying attention. This was especially the case with the ultra-rare orange Gamers known as aged Zoomers that are known to have existed on Zebes at one point, as they seem to have a habit of following around larger creatures as they move near the Gamer for reasons that are still unclear. It is also known that these creatures do not feed on soil or rocks, instead acting as scavengers that feed off the dead tissue of other organic materials, which in turn makes them just as capable of spreading disease as the Zoomer is.
Despite this in the more heavily armored forms, they are still usually not aggressive and easy to avoid as long as you watch your step, so they belong to threat level Alpha alongside their Zoomer relative.
Silver Gamers were a rare sight and were only known to really exist in the deeper reaches of the planet, including superheated areas and damp caverns. While most insectoid creatures and the like are averse to extreme environments, these Gamers had managed to develop a tempered outer body, incorporating heavy metals from Zebes' rocks into the shells to harden them and make them almost impossible to penetrate with normal weaponry. While this hadn't changed their overall behavior at all, it did make them almost impossible to destroy with conventional weaponry. Only the powerful strike of a super missile or something similar was capable of penetrating their armored forms, and they usually weren't even worth the ammunition to waste it on as a threat.
As such, while they might have been heavily armored, these variants were still not much more of a danger than their normal kin, and are thus best assigned to threat level Beta.
The Rio family consisted of several insect-like creatures that are all genetically related and classified together as a result of their similar anatomies and behavioral patterns. The centerpiece of this family was the creature that gives it its namesake, the Rio, a fly-like beast that is noted as more of a pain than an actual threat, though they could be a problem in large swarms. The normal version of these creatures possessed small wings that were just strong enough to allow them to actually flit about in the air rapidly. They were fairly simple-minded and were easy to kill with any weapon when they were young, but older specimens tend to be more powerful and could withstand direct fire for at least a little bit. They mainly stuck to the roofs of caverns in the native environments, and only swooped down to attack when they could detect the motion of other creatures nearby, but they could easily tear apart smaller creatures with their long claws, and they had a surprising reach as their arms were about the same length as their body. The adults tend to move with up and down zigzag movements in the air, and could thus be quite easy to predict, but large swarms of younger specimens could be a nightmare to deal with, as they move so fast that it's virtually impossible to track an individual with any reliable targeting system. Plus, they are more likely to simply try and grab a target distracted while the rest of the swarm devoured it. Thankfully, they were fairly weak in all their forms, and therefore not as serious as armored soldiers. The flight pods these creatures lived in could act as a means of protection and reproduction, and thus needed to be destroyed in order to fully exterminate these creatures from an area. But their flight pods usually fairly sturdy and could only be destroyed with concussive weapons or high-powered beam weapons like the wave and plasma beams.
This shouldn't have made them that much more of a terrible threat to explorers. They were careful in how they approached them though, even if older specimens could prove to be a tad resilient to basic firepower, and thus have a deserving place within threat level Beta.
Crateria was also once home to a relative of the Rio, the Mellow, which was without a doubt the weakest member of the family and only a threat in large numbers. Because they were much smaller than their close relatives and had little in the way of offense aside from a small set of scissor-like mandibles, these monsters always traveled in large numbers and relied on the power of swarms in order to kill larger creatures and feed off their carcasses, sometimes without even killing the creature in question. The small beast could be taken out with a single shot of any weapon, but more mellows could be produced from mellow hives quite easily if nearby, leaving the destruction of the hive as the only way to really get rid of them. Mellows in a hive usually just loitered around and kept an eye on targets, but the moment they saw the hive under attack, they would continuously be bored and fly at the offending target to remove it. Unfortunately for them, this left the hive open to attack, which is not a good thing for them as the hives were soft and did not have much in the way of internal supports. As such, as mellow hives took damage, their soft parts would slowly start to fall off and liquefy until the entire structure collapsed in a heap of goo, leaving the weak mellows to fly off.
The only real problem that could come with these creatures was the ability to seemingly pass through walls and floors through tiny cracks and crevices, though it is unknown how they actually biologically accomplished this feat. But even then, they were too weak to be much of a concern and were better left alone unless it became extremely annoying or the hives blocked passages through an area, leaving them and the hives as a whole within threat level Alpha.
Ripper 2 was the name for a variant of the Ripper that had been converted into a cyborg by Zebesian space-powered forces. It came in different color variants with varying resistances against damage as with the Ripper, though mainly having purple and red shells. But what truly separated these creatures from the rest of their kin was the fact that they had fire-spewing rockets attached to their backsides. Aside from allowing them to actually propel themselves without having to rely on their back feet to kick off, This granted these creatures a tremendous speed boost that allowed them to move at more than twice the normal speed of a ripper, making it much more harder to catch up to them and freeze them, though they were still vulnerable to the same types of weaponry. It is last to note that there was once a rare metallic green colored variation of the Ripper 2 that possessed a highly magnetized shell that could be latched onto with a grapple beam and thus used as a living grapple point, and it would stay motionless in the air while its body is being electrified by the beam's presence.
All in all though, these entities were no more dangerous in terms of offensive power compared to the normal Ripper, just much faster and thus mildly more difficult to avoid or get around, and thus belonged in threat level alpha alongside the fully organic variant.
Do you have any idea how annoying it is to have to try and install forces into a beast like this? It's not like you can just strap them on with duct tape or some stupid shit. No, you have to work your ass off sedating them, making sure the inorganic components are going to match with the living tissue there, and then try and get them to learn how to fly in a stable line and not blast off into a bloody wall. Just not worth the damn effort, I tell ya. No idea what geniuses thought this was a good idea.
Zebes were small, beetle-like insectoids that made the home of the interior workings and pipe systems of Crateria and Brinstar prior to the destruction of Zebes. These simple insects possessed a lightly armored shell similar to that seen on a rhinoceros beetle from Earth, and had almost identical physical features. However, they could not be classified as true insects as they only had 2 pairs of limbs. These creatures fed off smaller, more insignificant insectoids, as well as the occasional mineral-laced rock for sustenance, crushing the food stuff with powerful jaws that were deceptively strong for their small size. Up until the destruction at the end of Zebes, these entities, along with other insectoid beasts of a similar size, had created massive hives beneath the surface of the planet and occupied more space in the planet's interior than almost any other type of organism. Most of the time, these creatures would remain in the ground and not bother other life forms, but when they had the urge to feed or otherwise had to leave their homes to find food, they do not dig their own tunnels. Instead, they used a pair of massive central horns on their heads to ram the sides of air holes that lead to the surface until they could crack them and make an opening. Once the hole was made, these entities could freely fly in and out of air holes to the surface where there is plentiful food, returning only after getting their fill or forced to escape a large predator.
As far as monsters go, these creatures were very weak and can easily be destroyed with only a shot or 2 from a weapon before dying, but they could still fly quite fast, and the twin horns made it a bad idea to get in their way, especially since the force of their impact had the habit of knocking others into hazards that may be more dangerous than the creatures themselves, occupying a solid niche in threat level alpha.
Zebes were small, bee-like insectoids that made the home of the interior workings and pipe systems of Crateria and Brinstar prior to the destruction of Zebes. These simple insectoids possessed a strikingly bee-like form and were so close in appearance that they might have seemed indistinguishable from afar. What did make them stand out, however, was the fact that they were much larger than earth bees and had highly enlarged eyes, probably used to traverse the dark corridors of Zebes' inner tunnels. These entities fed off of smaller, more insignificant insectoids by approaching them from behind and attacking with their large front appendages, though the weak nature usually meant they were unable to hurt much of anything, oftentimes requiring multiple trips to a surface cavity in order to find enough food to survive. Up until the destruction with the end of Zebes, these creatures, along with other insectoid beasts of a similar size, had created massive hives beneath the surface of the planet and occupied more space in the planet's interior than almost any other type of organism. Most of the time, these creatures would remain in the ground and not bother other life forms, but when they did have the urge to feed, otherwise had to leave their homes to find food, they did not dig their own tunnels. Instead, they used their bodies to ram the sides of air holes that led to the surface until they could crack them and make an opening. Once the hole was made, these creatures could freely fly in and out of air holes to the surface where there is plentiful food, returning only after getting their fill or forced to escape a large predator.
As far as monsters go, these creatures were also very weak and could usually only sustain a shot or 2 from a weapon before dying, but they could still fly quite fast and could often be a bad idea to get in the way, especially since the force of their blow had a habit of knocking others into hazards that may be more dangerous than the creatures themselves, occupying a solid niche in threat level alpha.
Weavers were unique insectoids named after the wave-like motions they made with their bodies as they floated in the air in search of food. These insectoids do not have any true limbs to speak of, the closest thing being the 2 shell-like structures that are attached to their bodies by strong connective tissue. These shell-like structures were filled with light gases that enabled them to float without having to really fly, which worked great for them as they could not obtain much in the way of food otherwise as a result of the lack of limbs. Instead, these little bosses were hunter-scavengers and fed off the corpses left behind by larger creatures, and as a result of this lifestyle, weavers were rarely found in large groups, preferring to scavenge alone to get their fair share of a meal. If food was scarce and they were on the brink of starving, however, weavers would not be afraid to attack in large groups in order to secure a quick meal for all, using their large mandibles to tear the flesh off soft prey. When not active, weavers would close their shell pieces around them to completely hide their bodies, ensuring they provoked as little attention as possible to potential predators. While they were content to simply live on their own and move around in a wavy pattern to increase the chance of coming across a random flying insect to snack on, though the true reason for this quirky movement pattern is still not totally understood, if they were threatened, wavers would close to shellhounds and rotate their bodies rapidly before dive-bombing their target, hoping that the blow would at least deter the predator from further attack. This might not have worked in most cases, but it is interesting to know that they become invulnerable to damage from beam weaponry while executing this attack. Strangely enough, wavers were some of the few creatures known from Zebes that had distinguishable genders, as the color of the male's body is slightly different from that of the female.
These entities do not have much way of serious offense to deal with for the most, but their semi-armored forms could still make them a bit trickier to handle without the aid of strong firepower to wipe them out quickly, so they are in a nice spot within threat level beta.
They were just ugly little fellas and lasses wonder, would you like to just move up and down, over and over all the time? But they get dizzy from it, as they have a hell of a laugh, their distraction, and they just like water balloon, what is to say?
The cargo was an insectoid. There was only a small portion of the structure that was often observed in the field within, and has at times been mistaken for said structure as a result of its size. In short, the cargo was a very small, semi-flightless insectoid that fed on tiny microorganisms in the soils and rock crevices of Zebes, and was almost completely unnoticeable. In fact, its small form was so small that it was usually not even noticed by human-sized creatures, though it could leap very high for its small size and uses tiny mandibles and physical momentum to inflict minute damage against others. What really made the cargo an interesting species, however, was their hive. Cargo hives were comprised of two main components, a soft inner core and a solid exterior shell. The outer shell, which is usually a sickly green color, was as hard as rock and virtually indestructible against weapons even as strong as the power bomb. Moreover, if the interior of the nest was shot, the entire ground even surrounding room could shake, showing just how deeply rooted and rigid this outer structure really was. The interior portion of the cargo hive was a red pulsating orb that contained not only the nesting burrows for the cargo, but also spare food reserves and pouches where the creatures could reproduce in safety. The inner orb was actually vulnerable to direct fire as a result of the large holes that filled the outer structure of the hive, but with every single shot, a part of the hive would break and release an angry cargo that would hop around its hive in an attempt to scare off potential predators.
Even so, the cargo were not that dangerous and could easily be destroyed with a single shot from any type of basic weapon, and even the interiors of the hives were soft enough that they too would be destroyed if hit enough times, rendering them a perfect pick for threat level alpha and best left to their own devices, as they were completely and utterly harmless as long as they were not provoked.
The damn thing looked like flippin' jelly sacks to me. I ain't afraid of them not one bit. And of course that little house could actually be pretty damn nutritious and tasty if you can get to it without blowing the whole damn thing up. Though they could be a little too sweet, so if you know what a sugar rush is, then at least some practice, that's what you could call the result. I prefer them to be a bit more savory, but yeah.
Key hunters emerge out of the pupa stage of the life cycle mere hours after entering it from the state of a zero or a similar larval beast, and while the different body colors may have resulted in them being more or less resilient against attack, they are practically identical when it came to the type of damage they could ultimately do. Key hunters were extremely intelligent insects that demonstrated in battle to be capable of using swarm tactics in order to overcome their prey, and would oftentimes work together in large numbers to gang up on larger creatures, attacking them when they least expected it. The key hunter came in two major forms, those that had sickle-like appendages and those with clawed appendages. The creatures that had sickle appendages were generally the more free-thinking members of the group, and used their limbs to hack and slash away at anything they felt was good enough to be a meal, oftentimes spitting balls of acid from afar beforehand in order to soften up their target. These creatures seem to have lost a pair of limbs in their evolution somehow, but it did not seem to be a major problem for them overall, as they were able to survive in many otherwise radically different and violent environments that constituted Planet Zebes, and would have differently colored exoskeletons depending upon that environment, with green being associated with Crateria and Brinstar, yellow for the wrecked ship, and red for Lower Norfair. Their wasp-like form also served them well, as they were able to dart in and out of areas very quickly and extremely maneuverably. The only exception to this came if they lost their wings, as their short appendages limited their motion on the ground and therefore could make them an easy target.
The sheer numbers these creatures could use to their advantage and to take out prey and potential predators alike could make them a terrifying force, and with their variable resilience helping them to survive in even the harshest of locales on Zebes, these beasts are easily rated at threat level beta and certainly best approached with a maximum firepower to eliminate them quickly.
The beatom was a parasitic insectoid characterized by its massive eye, its large single pair of legs, and its overall sickly colored appearance. These creatures had fairly small mandibles and were not powerful enough on their own to inflict considerable physical trauma on a target, so they instead took on the life of a parasite in order to get the nutrition they desired. The beetle uses large legs to hop quickly from one place to another in search of prey, and once they found something that could be made into a suitable meal, they would target and focus on them with their massive eye, which was equipped to correct for a lack of binocular vision to register decent depth perception, before leaping at them without warning. Before their prey had a chance to get out of the way, they would sink their small teeth into flesh and even metal and start to suck the vital fluids out of them for energy, their eye glowing a bright red as they fed on a sign of aggression. These monsters could be a pain to deal with in many cases, as their exoskeletons were surprisingly sturdy and were effectively immune to all beam-based forms of weaponry, but it is known that the exoskeleton was still somewhat brittle and could thus be shattered with a concussive weapon like the missile or morph ball bombs.
They might have tried to emulate the energy-draining powers of the Metroid for their own biological purposes, but these beasts could be easy to deal with and thus should not have posed a substantial threat even in numbers, rendering them fit for a place in threat level beta.
That doesn't mean you wouldn't shut up and get the hell out of there while you could, though. Boogers could gang up on you real easy, and they don't like to be denied their meal. I'd stick them in the face, if you can call it a face, and then set them alight. Wouldn't recommend eating them, though. Tastes like battery acid when well done.
The Chute of Planet Zebes had a slightly different body structure compared to the Chute Leech of SR-388, but nonetheless behaved identically to them in the wild. The Chute possessed a flat green body that was shaped a bit like a manta ray from Earth, as the bodies came to fin-like points on the sides that allowed them to swim in the native waters, though they were also known to be able to survive for a few hours at a time outside the water if needed. They only possessed a single pair of eyes in the body, but this did not seem to deter them too much, as they would launch themselves into the air the moment a potential prey item walked within their field of sight. Unlike the Chute Leech, these creatures had their mouths on the underside, and they were filled with a row of jagged teeth perfectly designed for cutting into larger prey and removing large discs of flesh from their body. These entities would flap side to side as they moved though, which could disorient them a bit, but equally made them harder to hit from below. Thankfully for most, these creatures were not well equipped to deal with armored foes, and thus relatively easy for experienced explorers to avoid, and could actually be turned into useful tools with freezing weapons, as their ability to leap high into the air made them the perfect candidates to make platforms out of.
As such, these entities were indeed fairly easy to avoid, and had no real way of causing direct harm to others outside of contact with their body, thus belonging within threat level Alpha.
Alacoons were an evolutionary step up from the dragon beasts they are related to because they are adapted for life on land and not in lava. These creatures use their sturdy legs and small otherwise useless wings to burrow deep into the ground and wait until they could feel vibrations approaching them. Once they felt that their target was close enough, these creatures would rapidly leap from their burrows and surprise their target before blasting them with a string of fireballs to roast them, at which point the Alacoon could feed freely. The ability to survive on land made the Alacoon one of the few creatures to ever survive in Norfair and Zebes as a whole, alongside the less advanced genetic relatives, but it is known that this change had made them a bit weaker than relatives defensively, as they could be hurt by all types of conventional weaponry.
Nonetheless, they can more than roast those that couldn't take them down the moment they launched any sort of surprise attack, and thus could bring their fiery nature wherever they chose to roam, rendering them a suitable entrant into threat level beta.
The Bullion was a small, gelatinous creature known for enjoying semi-artificial environments where there was a steady supply of biological and metallic materials to feed off of. These creatures possessed a very soft, gel-like body that could be shaped and molded into just about any form without harming the organism, though it could be ripped to pieces with sufficient force. These creatures did not really have any internal organs to speak of. Instead, their bodies were effectively legions of many, many smaller cells that worked together as a community in order to create the appearance of a larger organism. The Bullion was not that harmful to most, as the only thing it could really do to attack was to throw its body at something in order to inflict contact damage. This is, however, exactly what was supposed to happen. Because these creatures do not have anything in the way of limbs or other offenses to work with, the only thing that they could do to feed was to excrete a powerful enzyme over their bodies as they leapt at a potential target and use that enzyme layer to dissolve a portion of the prey and then absorb that dissolved portion to extract nutrients and other compounds they could need to then break down and sustain themselves. Despite this horrifying method of consumption, these creatures were actually relatively harmless to larger entities and could actually be useful as platforms if they could be frozen in place of something like the ice beam before they leapt out of the small holes they habitually crammed their bodies into, trying to disguise themselves as ordinary stone blocks. Which is probably a good thing, as only morph ball bombs, power bombs, and super missiles had the concussive force needed to actually damage them.
Still, the otherwise simple and harmless nature towards larger entities could make them rather easy to ignore and avoid if needed, even if their gooey pseudopods could stick to rugged surfaces, placing them directly within the confines of threat level Alpha.
These little entities could have just as much potential to them, you know. Those gelatinous forms can make for incredible cohesive experiments, staking them to objects of all sorts and reverse engineering their protoplasm. Think of it, a sticky glue that can be molded to any shape you would desire. It would be a wonderful work of achievement. A sad loss indeed. But, oh well, at least we can have the memories of a simulation. There are already emerging limitations to what I can do at all here, it seems.
The Dakora is a rare two-legged avian creature that is far smarter and more resourceful than many give it credit for being. The Dakora is a legendary bird in Chozo lore, said to represent the power of speed for its incredible ability to accelerate its body movements to near the speed of sound. Not surprisingly, the Chozo tried their best to emulate this power artificially along with some of their own specialty mobility-based powers, and their efforts eventually yielded the Speed Booster upgrade. Dakoras usually possess green feathered bodies with a frill in their skulls for display purposes during mating season, as well as large solar purple eyes and a powerful beak they use to crush spore nodules and seeds for sustenance. While they might not seem that important outside of a zoological analysis, it has been observed these creatures are remarkably good at remembering the shapes and forms of objects and what they can do, even if they have only seen the devices in operation once. As a result, these creatures were valued among more intelligent organisms on the planet Zebes for finding the right types of parts and constructing devices, and often teamed up with creatures like the Edicoons when they needed to build something substantial, like a spacecraft, and since they are both herbivorous but eat different types of food, their mutual partnership seems to be impossible to easily break mentally and biologically. The Edicoon is a blue, monkey-like creature adored for its cute appearances and mannerisms, as well as a small set of extrasensory antennae on their heads, which are actually utilized by these creatures in order to communicate with others of the same species telepathically. Edicoons might be relatively simple herbivores, and generally do not raise much of a concern, but they're nonetheless surprisingly sentient and show an extreme affinity for working with machinery. So much, in fact, they have been observed building their own spacecraft out of leftover junk if they can find all the parts they need to make a job possible. Some say it is the hum of an engine or the shininess of metal that attracts them, but their ability to build their own spacecraft seems to betray this simplistic overview of their minds, though they can still be a bit of a problem if they decide to tinker around with the spaceships of others and accidentally break or damage something while exploring. Their inquisitive nature certainly extends beyond that of earth monkeys and can make them a hazard in shipyards, but for the most part, they are completely harmless creatures and tend to show a fondness towards other forms of intelligent life, even going so far as to help them get out of a sticky situation when needed.
Wrapping this up all together, the remarkable intelligence and sociability of these entities made them much more of a benefit to encounter than a threat, and cannot belong in any threat level higher than Alpha, with the only real threat there being the threat of them teaching other organisms special techniques to help destroy or avoid larger monsters in the wild.
The Tripper was a machine built by the Chozo in order to help with the transportation of goods across the breadth of the planet Zebes' rocky surface. The Tripper had the appearance of a beetle-like creature with thick green armor covering it, a yellow eye that was wirelessly connected directly into an old Chozo transport system mainframe, and a large platform-shaped extension on the top of its body. These machines moved across wide open spaces on the surface of Crateria and in some parts of Norfair on a set path, using a small blue jet of flame created from a thruster on the back of their body to move forwards. While they did move back and forth in set paths, it is known that these creatures possess different propulsion strengths that could dictate just how much weight they're actually able to support. This issue seems to have been constructed as such in order to save on materials and building engines that might otherwise not be needed to run at full power in order to perform their duties. In other words, while some of these machines were able to take the full weight of an adult human without any trouble, other members of the same production line may have only been able to support a fraction of that and would steadily lose altitude as more weight than they were supposed to be able to handle was piled on. Thankfully for their sake, there is a small secondary jet on their underside that could be used to boost them back up to the normal flight path if they fell.
These machines were heavily armored and could only be destroyed with the force of a power bomb, but this was usually not necessary as they were totally harmless on their own and merely served to act as carriers, making them the perfect creatures to hatch a ride on if one was looking to explore the portions of the regions they are assigned to that are otherwise impossible to reach, landing them within threat level Alpha.
I get that they needed to really save on resources since the bases here were mainly below the surface, but seriously, the Chozo could have done better here. It's a cute ball and it got the job done, sure, but wouldn't even be the point here if they couldn't carry the loads equally. The variable thrust of power is just shoddy craftsmanship in my opinion. Birds weren't perfect. No one ever is.
The Yapping Maw was a vicious plant form that proved to be a thorn in the sides of many explorers that did not heed its appearance among the flora and waters of Zebes. These creatures possessed a very simple anatomy with a small root base, a thick armored neck, and a large grasping claw, that serves both the house of the central nervous system and the digestive system. These plants are usually found growing in water and among Samus eater plants, the latter case being the result of a symbiotic relationship that helped both plant forms get food more easily while providing the yapping maw a place to root. They were virtually indestructible to all forms of damage and were thus a noble hazard, but they could still be frozen with weapons like the Ice Beam and thus be rendered a moot threat with the right equipment. The yapping maw usually kept its body low to the ground or below water as it waited for a potential prey item to move near it. How exactly the creature was able to detect prey is still unknown, but it may have been due to a mysterious extrasensory organ in the head that could detect minute changes in nearby currents, both air and water. Regardless, the moment something came into range, they would extend their massive stalk and clamp onto the nearby target, the sharp barbs sending their appendage biting through flesh and even metal as the yapping maw pulled the creature near its root base, either into pools of water filled with spikes and enemies, or into a Samus eater, which could usually dispose of the prey readily from there. While the yapping maw could certainly be a great annoyance, they are capable of only dealing minor damage to well-armored explorers, and thus were not that big of a problem, especially since they could only clamp down so long before they had to release their grip to avoid tearing the delicate tissue that kept their appendages operational.
As such, on their own, yapping maws could usually be ignored and should have been, as long as one had the equipment needed to stop their movement or simply jump out of the range before they can clamp down on their fleeing target, placing them within threat level alpha. Now, let's end this analysis with a few powerful enemies to be found, as well as a look at the space pirates that once used this place as a home, per se.
The space pirates are a confederation of many species that have come to work together for the sake of nothing short of galactic conquest, but time and time again they are defeated by the Hunter and the forces of the Galactic Federation. While their mindsets might be the same in most cases, their anatomical form can differ considerably alongside the types of technology they have available to them. The Zebesian space pirates are the creatures that first truly established the Space Pirate Confederacy, and are the joint staff behind the actions of Mother Brain, one of the greatest space pirate leaders to ever exist. While the name might tell otherwise, the Zebesian space pirates actually originated in a star system far from Zebes, and were only brought into the category of a true galactic threat after a team led by Ridley proved to Mother Brain that they had the potential to be the foot soldiers she needed to attack the Galactic Federation head-on. As such, these creatures were only referred to as Zebesians because they effectively took the planet for their own and saw themselves as its true inhabitants and the only intelligent creatures that deserved to exist there. The normal Zebesian space pirate comes in a cavalcade of different colors and forms, but its anatomy is essentially the same. These beasts possessed an arthropod-like body with a thick exoskeleton-like hide and sturdy bone structure that made them very resilient against attack in most cases, though their outer shell was only really good for close combat as they could easily be penetrated with basic energy weapons at the lowest rung of power. They possessed a reduced head structure that had a very short, somewhat inflexible neck, and large eyes that are perfectly adapted for seeing both visible color and infrared when needed. Their arms and legs were fairly thin in structure, but while they only had a single digit on each of their legs, their arms ended in a pair of pincher-like appendages that could not only use to be attack others in close quarters, but could also be used as organic guns, firing concentrated bursts of plasma that could inflict minor damage in some cases, but also could be powered up as they grew and have new technology integrated into the systems. Their eyes can sometimes even be used to deliver this same sort of attack, but this usually is frowned upon, as usually this attack will blind them for a few seconds after use. They were also adept climbers and capable of climbing sheer rock walls and smooth surfaces with the small spines for their pinchers and legs, enabling them to gain the high ground in nearly any situation.
The only thing that served as serious downfall for them was that they were weak normally, as their most basic level, Zebesians, who possessed a purple coloration that turned blue in the presence of Zebes' atmosphere, were not able to deal and especially take much in the way of damage, usually dying after only a single or a few shots from a weak weapon like the power beam, rendering these specific iterations as only worthy of occupying threat level alpha.
Green Zebesian space pirates were the first of many examples of what the Zebesians would do in order to make themselves more of a threat. While the space pirates in charge of the Talonfall research into Phazon were the first to experiment with bioengineering weapons with the material, the Zebesian space pirates had been modifying their own bodies for some time before that using Chozo bioengineering technology, though the limited intelligence and war mongrel thoughts of Zebesian space pirates rendered these upgrades less than useful when out in the field, as they rarely ever changed their behavior regardless of the type of upgrade they received. Green Zebesians were the result of these creatures fusing copper alloy armor to their bodies that readily oxidized in the oxygen-rich atmosphere of Zebes, turning them a green color.
This made them immune to basic weapon fire from most weak beam types, but they could still be hurt by powerful beam weapons and could easily be blown apart with the concussive forces associated with missiles and morph ball bombs, leaving them with only a slightly elevated level of threat, namely threat level beta, compared to basic Zebesians.
The chorizo was a bizarre organism whose actual physical construction remains a relative mystery, though it is more than apparent that it was far more hostile than the creatures responsible for its creation. Chozo statues in general are creations that only the most honored and trusted Chozo were allowed to create because, as strange as it may sound, the Chozo statues themselves were alive to some extent. Bioscans clearly demonstrate that there is a small degree of organic material present in these statues, though the actual amount of biological material seems to vary from one statue to another. The chorizo was the most sentient type of Chozo statue, and was usually tasked with protecting the most valuable upgrades and items of Chozo origin, going so far as to fully animate themselves and shed their rocky outer skin, a disguise to make them look like normal Chozo statues, in order to attack and defend the items they are made to protect. It is still unknown exactly how these otherwise inanimate objects were even able to move or possess an intelligence of any kind, but remnants of the creatures suggest that they were gifted with limited neural tissue in their heads and had a strange blood-like substance flowing through them that was densely packed with the same type of energy that Metroids were designed to feed off of. The fact that this energy could freely animate these creatures is amazing on its own, but it is made even more so by the dedication they showed for their purpose and the willingness to stay in stasis for many, many years before ultimately awakening to serve their duty and protect the items they were entrusted with. The standard chorizo possessed a body that looked very much like the Chozo in its base look, including their beak, eye structure, and physical form, but they had possession of a number of different attacks that normal Chozo did not have access to. The sharp claws on these living statues were strong enough to cut through steel and could thus inflict considerable damage if a direct hit was landed. Even if they couldn't use them up close, chorizo could pump energy into their claws and swipe harshly in the air to generate a series of energy waves that had to be ducked or jumped over in order to avoid. In addition, these creatures had been implemented with Morph Ball Bomb technology and were able to spew a torrent of explosive fake item smears from their mouths when needed, dealing serious concussive damage in the process. The body of the chorizo was well armored and effectively impervious to penetrate most places, but the creature did have a single weak point in its chest area, as it served as a location for the energy core that was responsible for allowing them to actually survive without a direct form of sustenance. Direct damage to this core with beam weaponry and missiles could cause internal damage to the creature and damage the conduit lines that carried energy that granted it life. This would slowly cause the body to deteriorate to the point where their heads would come off, a sign that they were about to fall to pieces and could not take much more damage before being completely destroyed.
While the mere thought of their existence would likely bring up more questions than answers, as combatants, these living machines could not just put up a fight, but had a number of natural weapon systems to them that could make them tricky to combat compared to most other natives on Zebes, and in turn, rightfully earning a strong classification within threat level Gamma.
I still find it to be utterly astounding that the Chozo were able to give their own statues a sense of life. But these entities just took it a step further, and it makes me sad to have never examined a live one up close. The way of the warrior was always of value to their culture, even outside of war, for it brought with it wonderful ideals that helped to safeguard their technology and their way of life, a trait that I find to be quite honorable. Even with their limited intelligence, the combat protocols installed into these contracts were impressive in their efficiency. They might not have all been the sturdiest or the strongest, but there is far more to life than such things.
While it might not have been teeming with life in the same way as Zebes' subsurface was, Crateria nonetheless proved to be a strong contender for explorers to use caution in. As at the time of the planet's destruction, it had finally begun to heal itself from the ravages of the Zebesian space pirates, with an ecosystem starting to emerge that could have rivaled that of the subsurface if given enough time. Moreover, the life that did exist there was not to be feared by most, as basic armor suits could be enough to fend off the attacks of the worst creatures to be found there for the most part. While it was also equally scarce when it came to valuable collectibles and upgrades for further exploration at one point, and nonetheless proved to be the best and safest place for explorers to settle down initially, which might explain why much of the first Chozo settlements on the planet were attached directly to this area. It may be limited to virtual examinations now, but the calm, quiet winds and rain in this land will be forever entombed in the memories of those that once lived upon it, and those that go to it when they need memories of a time much simpler, before the threat of galactic peace became too great for many to ignore.
We are just getting started here on our examination of Zebes, so make sure to stay tuned, for next we are going to be digging beyond the surface of this world and heading into the thick hollow crust of the planet, as we travel into the cavernous depths of Zebes and explore the rocky and once plant-filled extent of the planet, the subterranean world of Brinstar.
Thank you for reaching the end of this presentation. While we might not always get along, the Space Pirates and myself, in whatever capacity we can manage, are dedicated to analyzing and examining the life forms of many different worlds, extant and extinct, to show the great variety of life that exists out within the greater cosmos. If you enjoyed this info video and would like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe for more information. We'll do our best to keep pumping out data so the greater public has an understanding of what to expect when exploring alien planets and their denizens. With that, have a safe journey, and have your bribes prepared beforehand if you happen to come near our territory.